Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in Charlottesville, Virginia, on August 11, 2017, was thick. It was thick with the oppressive, wet heat of a southern summer, and it was thick with something far more toxic. As dusk fell on the idyllic campus of the University of Virginia, a line of fire snaked its way across the lawn. It was a procession of men, young men mostly, dressed in the bizarre uniform of this new movement, white polo shirts, khaki pants, and faces lit from below by the flickering flame of garden tiki torches. They marched, hundreds of them, toward the university's rotunda, a monument designed by Thomas Jefferson, and they chanted. The chants were not subtle. They were a raw, primal scream of ideology. You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. They encircled a small, terrified group of counter-protesters and students at the base of Jefferson's statue. There was shoving, sprays of mace, the smell of citronella fuel and pepper spray. The police were, by most accounts, tragically late. This was not a protest. It was a threat. It was a promise. And it was only the beginning. The next day, August 12th, the promise was kept. The polo shirts were replaced with helmets, makeshift shields, and sticks. The city's downtown, specifically a small park then named Emancipation Park, became a battlefield. Organized phalanxes of white supremacists clashed violently with anti-fascist groups and local citizens. The air was filled with shouts, the thud of wood on plastic shields, the sting of chemical sprays. The state of emergency was declared before the rally was even scheduled to begin. And then, at 1:42 p.m., after the police had finally dispersed the brawling crowds from the park, the rally's brutal climax arrived. A 2014 gray Dodge Challenger, driven by a 20-year-old from Ohio named James Alex Fields, Jr., turned onto the narrow, crowded 4th Street. The street was filled with counter-protesters, marching away from the chaos, chanting, celebrating what they thought was a victory. The Challenger slowed, then accelerated with intent, plowing directly into the back of another car, which slammed into the crowd. The sound was a sickening crunch of metal and bone. The car reversed, its tires stained, and fled. In the aftermath, dozens were wounded. Some, like Marcus Martin, were thrown into the air, his leg shattered. Others, like Natalie Romero, suffered skull fractures. And one woman, 32-year-old Heather Heyer, was killed. The immediate question was, what happened? The simple answer was a domestic terrorist attack. The criminal justice system focused on the driver, James Alex Fields, Jr. He was quickly arrested, charged, and in 2018 convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Case closed. But for many, that was not the answer to the real question. The real question was, why did it happen? Was James Alex Fields, Jr. a lone wolf, an isolated extremist who just showed up? Or was he the entirely predictable, perhaps even intended result of a meticulously planned event? Was the violence that soaked the streets of Charlottesville an accident, or was it the entire point? Today, we are not dissecting the mind of a single killer. We are dissecting the anatomy of a conspiracy. We explore how a team of lawyers and 9 private citizens used a 150-year-old law, forged in the fires of Reconstruction, to dismantle a modern hate movement. This is the story of Signs versus Kessler, a landmark case that proved the violence in Charlottesville wasn't a byproduct of the rally. It was the rally. To understand the legal battle, we must first understand the 9 people who brought it. They were not abstract victims. They were the targets. Elizabeth Signs was a second-year student at the UVA School of Law. She was one of the students surrounded by the Tiki Torch March on August 11th, maced and terrified. She watched the next day as the violence unfolded, feeling like a refugee in her own city. Devin Willis was a third-year African-American student at UVA. He joined the counter-protest at the Jefferson statue and was hit with pepper spray, burning his eyes and skin as he was encircled by chants of blood and soil. Natalie Romero, another UVA student, was marching peacefully on 4th Street when the Challenger struck. She was hit from behind, suffering a concussion and a hairline fracture of her skull. She would later testify about the memory lapses, the crippling headaches, and the end of her academic ambitions at UVA. Marissa Blair was there on 4th Street with her fiancé, Marcus Martin. She was Heather Heyer's co-worker and friend. She watched paralyzed as the car struck the crowd, throwing her fiancé into the air and killing her friend just feet away from her. The trauma was unimaginable. There were others. April Major, a local resident, Seth Wispelwey and his wife, 2 local faith leaders who came to bear peaceful witness and were met with vitriol and violence. All 9 of them carried the physical and psychological scars of those 2 days. They wanted justice, but they also wanted something more. They wanted to ensure this could never happen again. They found their champions in a legal team led by Roberta Kaplan and Karen Dunn. Kaplan was famous for her work on United States v. Windsor, the Supreme Court case that struck down the Defense of Marriage Act. Dunn was a formidable trial lawyer, a former federal prosecutor. They assembled a team from their firm, Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink, and partnered with the nonprofit organization Integrity First for America. Their plan was audacious. They weren't going after the foot soldier, James Fields. He was already in prison. They were going after the generals, the organizers, the promoters, and the ideologues who had summoned the troops to Charlottesville. They filed a civil lawsuit, Signs versus Kessler, naming the primary architects of the Unite the Right rally as defendants. The list of defendants was a who's who of the mid-2010s alt-right movement. Jason Kessler, the primary local organizer from Charlottesville; Richard Spencer, the polished, media-savvy face of the movement, the man who coined the term alt-right and dreamed of a white ethno-state; Christopher Cantwell, a militant podcaster from New Hampshire who had become infamous as the crying Nazi after a Vice documentary. And it wasn't just individuals. They sued the organizations, Matthew Heimbach and his Traditionalist Worker Party, Michael Hill and the League of the South, a neo-Confederate group, Identity Europa, a white identitarian organization, Vanguard America, the group James Alex Fields Jr. was photographed marching with. They even sued Robert Amador Ray, a neo-Nazi writer, and Elliot Klein, who helped run the rally's online planning. The legal challenge was immense. How do you sue a decentralized, online-fueled movement for violence committed by one person? The First Amendment protects speech, even hateful speech. The defendants would and did claim they were just organizing a political protest. This is where Kaplan and Dunn unearthed their weapon. It was not a new, high-tech law. It was a very old one, buried in the U.S. legal code, coated in the dust of history. They sued under 42 U.S.C. Section 1985-3, a key provision of the Enforcement Act of 1871, more commonly known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. To understand the power of this law, we must go back to 1871. The Civil War was over, but the fight for Reconstruction was raging. In the South, newly freed black citizens were exercising their rights to vote, to hold office, to own property, and a violent counter-revolution was rising to stop them. The first Ku Klux Klan was born, a terrorist organization dedicated to restoring white supremacy through lynchings, beatings, burnings, and mass voter intimidation. The federal government, then under President Ulysses S. Grant, recognized that state and local governments in the South were either unwilling or unable to stop the Klan. So Congress passed the KKK Act. The law was radical. It gave the federal government power to intervene. And critically, Section 1985(3) gave private citizens the power to sue other private citizens in federal court for conspiring to deprive them of their constitutional rights, like the right to travel, the right to assemble, and the right to not be attacked because of your race. The law was designed, quite literally, to stop organized, politically motivated racist violence. It fell into disuse for nearly a century, but in Sines versus Kessler, it was a perfect fit. The plaintiff's argument was simple. The defendants, Spencer, Kessler, Cantwell, and all the rest, had formed a conspiracy. The purpose of that conspiracy was to commit racially motivated violence against counter-protesters, Jewish people, African Americans, and their supporters in Charlottesville. The goal was to intimidate them, to silence them, and to deprive them of their rights. The rally was the mechanism of the conspiracy. To prove this, they needed more than just the defendants' public statements. They needed to get inside the planning. They needed to prove intent. And in the 21st century, the planning for a racist conspiracy doesn't happen in a secret barn. It happens online. The lawyers for the plaintiffs struck digital gold. They got their hands on a massive, leaked archive from the social media platform Discord. Discord was, at the time, a popular chat service for gamers, but its private invite-only servers were also the perfect place for the Unite the Right organizers to plan their event in secret. The main server was called Charlottesville 2.0. What the legal team found in those chat logs was the anatomy of the crime laid bare. It was the conspiracy's blueprint. It was thousands of messages from hundreds of users, including the defendants themselves, meticulously planning not a peaceful protest, but a violent street battle. The defendants, it turned out, were obsessed with optics and plausible deniability. They discussed their plans openly, but with a thin veneer of code. They knew they would be seen as the aggressors if they started the violence, but the chats showed they fully intended to create violence. In the logistics and gear channels, the conversation was not about signs and bullhorns. It was about weapons. Jason Kessler, the lead organizer, posted guidelines. Flagpoles are fine, but try to keep them to a reasonable length. Shields are fine, body armor is fine. The chat logs were filled with discussions about the utility of flagpoles as weapons. One user, referencing a previous brawl in Berkeley, wrote, "A flagpole is a good weapon that is also a symbol." Another user, Tyrone, who was later identified as defendant Elliot Klein, wrote, "If you want to crack skulls, you are in the right place." The discussions were explicitly violent. Christopher Cantwell, using his screen name, wrote about his excitement for the rally, saying he was ready for the FC King violence. He encouraged others to come armed and prepared. Robert Asmodor Ray was even more blunt. He wrote, "This is a kinetic war, where our side is finally fighting back. This isn't a pillow fight. It's a real-world, kinetic, boots-on-the-ground, blood-and-soil conflict." The most chilling discovery, however, related directly to what happened on 4th Street. The idea of using cars as weapons against protesters was not an invention of James Alex Fields, Jr. It was a popular, celebrated meme within the movement. 2 months before the rally, a user posted a meme of a car plowing into protesters with the caption, "Pro tip, if you're protesting in the street, we have the right of way." More damningly, just 3 weeks before the Charlottesville rally, defendant Elliot Klein, using his based Seville alias, posted a gruesome image of a truck running over a protester, a person's body twisted under the wheels. The caption read, "Our new favorite game." The discussions were explicit. One user asked, "Is it legal to run over protesters blocking roads?" Another replied, "It is in some states, and you can certainly make the case that you were afraid for your life." This was the culture they were building. This was the violence they were encouraging. The server was also a cesspool of racial and anti-Semitic hatred. The defendants and organizers referred to counter-protesters, Jewish people, and black residents with the most vile slurs imaginable. This wasn't just speech. The lawyers argued it was proof of motive. It established the racial animus required by the KKK Act. Armed with this digital smoking gun, the legal team reframed the entire narrative of those 2 days in August. The violence wasn't a series of unfortunate, spontaneous clashes. It was a script written in Discord and performed live on the streets of Charlottesville. Let's re-examine the timeline through this lens. The August 11th Tiki Torch March. The chats showed this was planned as a show of force, a deliberate act of intimidation. They planned to take the park at UVA. When they arrived and found the small group of students, they didn't retreat. They encircled them. The plaintiffs, like Elizabeth Sines and Devin Willis, testified to the terror of being surrounded, maced, and threatened by a mob chanting blood and soil. This was Act 1 of the conspiracy, a successful test of intimidation. Then, August 12th, the rally at Emancipation Park. The Discord chats detailed the command structure. The different militia groups, League of the South, Traditionalist Worker Party, were to form a shield wall. They were to hold the line. But the evidence showed they did more than that. Videos from that morning show the phalanxes of defendants' groups marching into the park in formation, armed with shields, clubs, and flagpoles. They didn't wait to be attacked. They charged the counter-protesters gathered at the bottom of the park. The brawl was immediate and brutal. This was not self-defense, the lawyers argued. This was the planned offensive. This was the kinetic war that Amador had promised. The police declared an unlawful assembly and shut the event down, forcing the groups to disperse. But the conspiracy, the plaintiffs argued, was not over. The city was now filled with armed, enraged, and violent men who had been primed for a war by the defendants. And that is when James Alex Fields, Jr. got into his Dodge Challenger. The plaintiff's legal team had to connect Fields to the conspiracy. This was the final, crucial link. They didn't argue that Richard Spencer or Jason Kessler personally called Fields and told him to attack. They didn't have to. Under civil conspiracy law, they just had to prove two things. First, that Fields was a part of the conspiracy, and second, that his act, the car attack, was a foreseeable consequence of that conspiracy. For the first point, they had the evidence. Fields wasn't a lone wolf. He had driven from Ohio for this event. He was photographed that morning marching in formation with Vanguard America, one of the defendant organizations. He was holding one of their black and white shields. He was an active participant. For the second point, they had the Discord chats. The defendants had created an atmosphere where car attacks were celebrated. They had joked about it. They had promoted it as a tactic. They had filled their followers with rage and a sense of war. When you prime hundreds of young, angry men for a blood-and-soil conflict, and then set them loose in a city, is it really a surprise when one of them uses a twattin' weapon? The plaintiffs argued it was not a surprise at all. It was the logical, foreseeable, and tragic culmination of the entire plan. Heather Heyer's death and the injuries to the plaintiffs on 4th Street were not a separate crime. They were the final act of the conspiracy planned on the Charlottesville 2.0 server. The trial of Saenz versus Kessler began in federal court in Charlottesville in October 2021. It lasted 4 weeks, and it was a circus. Many of the key defendants, including Spencer, Kessler, and Cantwell, chose to represent themselves, a legal term known as pro se. This led to bizarre and chaotic courtroom scenes. They were inept as lawyers, prone to spouting their ideology on the stand and often bickering among themselves. Richard Spencer, in his signature dapper suit, cross-examined the plaintiffs, forcing them to relive their trauma. He asked Elizabeth Saenz if the Tiki Torch marchers looked festive or like a fraternity. Christopher Cantwell, who had spent much of the intervening time in and out of jail on other charges, took the stand and had an emotional breakdown, echoing his crying Nazi video. He tried to portray himself as a victim, a shock jock who was just joking. But the plaintiffs' lawyers, Karen Dunn and Roberta Kaplan, were methodical. They were masters of the courtroom. They presented the discord evidence piece by piece, blowing up the messages on a giant screen for the jury to read. They played the video of the Tiki Torch March. They played the video of the morning's brawls. They played the horrifying, graphic video of the car attack. And they put their clients on the stand. The 9 plaintiffs told their stories, one by one. Natalie Romero described the feeling of the car hitting her, the searing pain in her head, and the end of her dreams. Devin Willis described the feeling of being a black man surrounded by a mob, chanting that his existence was a threat. Marissa Blair described the final, horrifying moments of her friend's life. Their testimony was the human cost of the conspiracy, the real-world consequence of the hateful jokes from the Discord server. The defendant's defense was essentially threefold. First, it was all protected speech under the First Amendment. Second, they were the real victims attacked by Antifa, and the police had failed to protect them. Third, they had nothing to do with James Alex Fields, Jr. Kaplan and Dunn dismantled these arguments. They argued the First Amendment does not protect a conspiracy to commit violence. It doesn't protect a plan. They showed evidence that the defendants' groups had initiated the violence on August 12, charging the counter-protesters first. And they argued that under conspiracy law, the defendants were responsible for Fields' actions, whether they knew him personally or not. He was their soldier, carrying out the mission they had defined. In his closing argument, one of the plaintiff's lawyers, Alan Levine, put it simply to the jury. They planned, executed, and then celebrated a 2-day spectacle of violence. They brought their racist, anti-Semitic poison to this community, and they left a trail of injury and death. On November 23, 2021, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. It was a complicated verdict sheet, but the result was a resounding victory for the plaintiffs. The jury found all defendants, every single individual and organization, liable for civil conspiracy under Virginia state law. They found that they had all engaged in a conspiracy to commit violence, intimidation, and to create a public nuisance. On the federal KKK Act charge, the jury deadlocked on the question of whether the defendants had conspired to commit racially motivated violence. However, they did find that several of the defendants' actions that day did violate the KKK Act. The state-level conspiracy verdict was the one that mattered most. And then came the damages. The jury awarded the plaintiffs a staggering $26 million. This was broken down. About $2 million was in compensatory damages, money to pay for the plaintiffs' medical bills, their pain, and their suffering. But the vast majority, $24 million, was in punitive damages. Punitive damages are not about compensation. They are about punishment. They are a jury's way of sending a message, not just to the defendants, but to the entire world, that their conduct was so outrageous, so malicious, and so harmful to society that they must be punished for it. The jury was, in effect, bankrupting the alt-right. In the immediate aftermath, the defendants scoffed. Richard Spencer called the verdict absurd. They claimed they were judgment-proof, that they had no money, and that the plaintiffs would never see a dime. And in a practical sense, they were mostly right. The plaintiffs have struggled to collect the full amount, but collecting the money was never the primary goal. The goal was consequences. The goal was accountability. The goal was to dismantle the machine. And in that, Saenz versus Kessler was a stunning success. The lawsuit, even before the verdict, was a wrecking ball. The legal process of discovery forced the defendants to turn over their private communications, to sit for hundreds of hours of depositions, and to face their own words under oath. This process alone cost them fortunes in legal fees they didn't have. It shattered their organizations. The Traditionalist Worker Party imploded. Vanguard America dissolved. Richard Spencer's National Policy Institute was crippled, and he has complained publicly that the lawsuit has financially ruined him. Liens were placed on the property of defendants like Christopher Cantwell and the League of the South. More importantly, it broke the back of the alt-right as a cohesive public-facing movement. The leaders were exposed as inept, broke, and consumed by infighting. The veneer of intellectual white nationalism was stripped away, revealing the banal, violent thuggery underneath. The Unite the Right rally was supposed to be their great coming-out party. Instead, Saenz versus Kessler turned it into their funeral. The anatomy of this case is the anatomy of a new form of lawfare. It provides a blueprint. It demonstrates how a 150-year-old law, written to fight men in white robes, can be used to fight men in white polo shirts. It shows that in the digital age, the smoking gun is no longer a weapon found at the scene. It is the server log. It is the chat history. It is the digital trail of intent that proves the violence wasn't an accident. The true anatomy of Charlottesville was not found in the broken bones or the twisted metal of a Dodge Challenger. It was found in the digital ether, in thousands of lines of text where the violence was authored before it was ever committed. The trial simply read their own script back to them, and for the first time forced them to pay for the ending they had written. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.